My grandpa served as a gunner in an M18 Hellcat during some intense moments of World War II. In one harrowing incident, the tank ahead of his was struck by a Panzerfaust. Tragically, he witnessed the loader, engulfed in flames, crying out for help as he crawled out and in utter despair, ended his own life because no one could reach him to offer aid. Not long after this grim scene, their own tank hit a mine, which blew off the track. Remarkably, they managed to repair it within just 2 hours. Later that same night, as they were returning to base camp, they encountered several German tanks backed by 30 to 40 soldiers. The other Hellcats in the formation didn't notice the enemy until my grandpa's commander spotted them and raised the alarm. He described the ensuing battle as a fiery hell. Initially, he had 20 men supporting him, but by the end of the confrontation, only 8 survived. During the fight, one Sherman tank was directly hit, and another was struck by an anti-tank rifle. Miraculously, no further injuries were reported among the crew. As the skirmish subsided, it became a grim sight with German soldiers everywhere. My great-grandfather had a unique experience. He was a T-34 tank driver, and somehow he managed to serve from the beginning to the end of the war, surviving through the fierce battles of Stalingrad and Berlin. Miraculously, as far as I know, his entire crew made it through without any casualties. It must have been an incredible, albeit harrowing, journey. My great-grandfather served on the USS Indianapolis, which suffered one of the most catastrophic naval disasters in history. Surviving the ship's sinking was just the beginning of his ordeal. When he returned home, he was deeply scarred by the experience, struggling with severe mental health issues that ultimately led him to take his own life. His story serves as a poignant reminder of the invisible wounds that many veterans endure long after the battles have ended. My uncle was in the 101st Airborne. He saved a squad from an enemy grenade and got a medal for it. My granddad was part of the Wehrmacht, serving in a heavy rocket artillery battalion during World War II. His service took him from Cannes, France, to the vast expanses of Russia. Throughout his military career, he rose to the rank of an officer and was awarded the Iron Cross. Reflecting on those years, he once wrote that they were the best times of his life, a sentiment influenced heavily by his beliefs at the time. He was deeply indoctrinated with Nazi propaganda. These are the snippets I know about him, mostly passed down through stories from my grandma. My great-grandfather led 2 Sherman tank battle groups during the war, and in both harrowing instances, he was the only one who survived. These experiences left him grappling with survivor's guilt, bearing the weight of being the sole survivor in both devastating losses. My grandfather was just a child during World War II, and whenever I would ask him to share his stories from that time, he would only repeat the same 2 tales, with everything else he recounted occurring post-war. Curious about the apparent gap in his wartime memories, I asked my mom why he never mentioned more. She revealed that after coaxing him into opening up one evening, he confided in her a deeply traumatic event that had scarred him for life. He had witnessed a group of soldiers, likely Russian, brutally attacking a young woman after doing inexplicable acts to her. I'm not going to spell it out, but you know what I mean. They inflicted such severe injuries on her, breaking every bone in her body and leaving her to die, that the horror of the incident had deeply affected him, explaining his reluctance to revisit his wartime experiences. My great Opa served as a German communications officer during World War II. He was responsible for sending what would be the last message to the Bismarck, informing the crew of imminent promotions. Unfortunately, he transmitted this message unencrypted, inadvertently allowing the Allies to intercept it. I understand the gravity of such events and the losses incurred, much like the fate that befell the battlecruiser HMS Hood. My condolences for any losses you've experienced related to these historic events. My great-grandpa served in the 82nd Airborne as a glider pilot and co-pilot during World War II. During Operation Market Garden, he was instructed by the pilot to sit at the back of the glider to balance the craft. Tragically, their glider crashed into a ditch, and only he and 2 other soldiers survived the ordeal. They were captured and subsequently spent the remainder of the war as prisoners of war in Stalag 13. He passed away peacefully in 2014 from a heart attack while asleep at the age of 97. On the other side of my family, my grandfather served in the Pacific Theater. Despite being on opposite sides of the conflict, it's important to remember that all involved were human beings, each with their own stories and struggles. I hold deep respect for both my grandfathers and the sacrifices they made. Wishing you safety and peace as we remember and honor these complex legacies. My grandfather also served in World War II, where he was a crewman on an M10 tank destroyer. His service came at a high personal cost. He lost a leg when an artillery shell exploded nearby. My great-grandfather was in the Croatian army during World War II, where he battled three main factions: the Scenics, Italians, and Nazis. He primarily fought against the Italian forces. He kept a treasured photo of a Spitfire pilot who regularly supported Allied bombers. Interestingly, the Dalmatia region, where he served, is dotted with relics from the war. You can even find a whole village there, built from the wreckage of military bombers. It's quite a sight. My great-uncle was a skilled pilot who flew interceptor missions in the FW-190, and later the TA-152 during World War II. I once read a gripping entry in his journal where he described a particularly tense mission. As he flew, he spotted enemy bombers directly over his family's home. The pressure was immense. He knew he couldn't afford a single mistake. Despite his precision, his initial dive to intercept missed. Desperate and driven by the need to protect his family, he made a daring decision to ram one of the bombers with his wing. Miraculously, he survived the encounter and continued serving until the war's end. My great-grandfather had a harrowing experience during World War II as a conductor of a train in Greece, transporting the wounded in 1945. His train came under attack by partisans who blew up the tracks both in front of and behind them, effectively trapping them. During a skirmish over a group of sheep, driven by sheer hunger, he suffered a severe injury from a saber that struck him just under his rib. Fortunately, he recovered by the time the war ended. I never had the chance to meet him. He passed away a few years before I was born. Although I can't be certain how he'd feel about me sharing his story, I believe, based on what my parents have told me, that he was a good man, not aligned with the ideologies of the Nazis. My parents always speak of him and his wife as wonderful people. My great-grandfather served on the Essex-class carrier Antietam during its time in service. Despite the tensions of war, he showed remarkable kindness, secretly feeding the Japanese prisoners aboard and treating them with the same humanity he would anyone else. His actions stand as a testament to his compassion in an era marked by conflict. Rest in peace, Ralph. Your legacy of kindness soars high. My grandfather was drafted into the Luftwaffe as a radio operator when he was just 20 years old. Unfortunately, that's where our knowledge of his service ends. We don't know the details of how he died, just that it was one of countless lives tragically lost during the war. My grandfather served in the Polish army just before the country fell during the war. His service took a dire turn when he was captured and placed in a death camp. Remarkably, he survived these brutal conditions and lived to be 89 years old. On a similar note of family military history, my dad's uncle served in the Canadian Army and was also captured. Fortunately, he was rescued by the American Army, adding another layer of resilience and survival to our family's wartime experiences. My grandfather served in the 6th Army, enduring the harrowing Battle of Stalingrad and subsequent captivity in Russia. Miraculously, he was among the fortunate few who survived these grueling conditions and returned to his family in the mid-1950s. He spent the remainder of his life peacefully, grateful for the second chance at life after the horrors of war. My grandfather, who served in the Korean War, often reflected on the nature of the conflict with a poignant quote. He would say, "During World War II, we were fighting against those who put people in ovens. In more recent times, it feels like we're fighting against a farmer in sandals who just wants to live his life." This perspective highlights the stark contrast he saw between the clear moral lines of World War II and the complex, often ambiguous nature of later conflicts. My dad served as Jimmy 1 on a troop ship tasked with evacuating soldiers from the battlefield. During a critical operation, the ship came under attack and was severely damaged, ultimately leading to it taking on water and the captain's tragic death. In a quick-thinking move, my dad dropped the ship's stern kedge anchors and managed to run the vessel aground, preventing it from sinking further. This decisive action allowed the royal troops on board to fight their way to safety. Eventually, they were rescued and taken off by a Royal Navy destroyer, ensuring their survival thanks to his heroic efforts. All right, that wraps up this episode. Thanks so much for tuning in, and a huge thank you to everyone who shared their family stories with us. If you have a World War II story about your ancestors that you'd like us to feature, please drop a comment below. We'll do our best to include it in a future video. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a like and subscribe for more. We've got new content coming regularly that you won't want to miss. See you next time.